Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of the Soul Sovereignty and Sexuality podcast with myself, Jessica Falcon, and a special guest today, Susan Morgan Taylor. And she's a somatic sex coach and relationship coach. And we are going to dive deep into a topic around desire, sexual desire in particular, which often is perceived as something very simple. Either you desire or you don't, but it is so much
Mm.
more complex, so much more multi-layered than that. And so we're going to dive into that. But before we do, I want to let you know that we recently had a conversation on her Sex Talk podcast as well. And I feel like you're going to want to listen to both of these conversations because we had a whole different conversation in that podcast around what sacred sexuality and feminine, the divine feminine, and just so many other little juicy tidbits that you're going to want to tune into on the Sex Talk podcast as well. And then today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into desire specifically, but we're definitely going to be putting we're out there together. So keep an eye on us. We're going to be having lots more conversations. Make sure you subscribe to both the podcasts so you don't miss any of the episodes. And Susan, I want to start by you have a really interesting background because you were, trained as a therapist
Mhm.
and you've also been in expressive dance. You've had
Mhm.
your own initiations and journeys into this. You were married for a really long time. You've talked about that with me a little bit about your journey with desire and your relationship. And so how did you get into doing somatic sex therapy work?
Mm.
And what was your journey around desire specifically, if you feel like
Oh
sharing?
gosh. Yeah, I mean that's like three podcast episodes like right there in that one question. So yes, I was in what I would qualify as a sexless marriage for 10 years. And it's been quite a long time now. It's been 16, 17 years since that marriage ended. So it's very far in the past, but I was in that marriage for 10 years. And I would qualify it as a sexless. I was the one who was really not interested in sex. Maybe once every several months, maybe we would have sex. And, I could have lots of orgasms, but it was still really unfulfilling for me. Like something was really missing. And it was over, kind of the 10-minute sex thing, lots of orgasms, and then it's done. And there was just something missing. There was just this more that I craved. I wanted a deeper spiritual connection. I wanted to have these experiences like full body orgasms that I had heard about, but always kind of thought those are for someone else, not for me. And so really did what any smart woman would do, and I just blamed my husband. And I say that in jest, right? Because this comes
Really
full.
common though,
I
right?
I know,
To blame
yes.
the other partner, like, oh,
I
that's
just
the problem. He's the
yeah.
problem. She's the problem. Yeah.
Right. I just blamed him for my lack of satisfaction. But meanwhile, I had no idea how to create the thing that I was longing for. And I titled it like the unidentifiable more. There's just this desire. There was this deep inner desire, this longing for something more. And yet I was at a complete loss for how to create that or how to get it. And so I just kind of put the responsibility for figuring it out on my husband. Fast forward, that marriage ended. There were a lot of other factors contributing to the end of the marriage, as well as I believe why it was sexless, which I didn't know it at the time. I learned about it later, but left the marriage, and my drive, my libido, my sexual energy just came back online like full force. It was so crazy. It was like night and day. Suddenly I felt alive again. And I wasn't interested in being sexual or having sex with lots of people like right after leaving the marriage. I actually took quite a bit of time, about a year and a half or 2 years before I sort of went back into intimate relationship and a more formal way. I just needed to have the grieving process. I had two little kids, and it was just very challenging going through that whole transition. So a couple of years later, I attracted a partner into my life who promised me he was going to offer me all these amazing experiences, such as, oh, you want a full body orgasm? No problem. I can give you a full body orgasm. I'm like, well, this is great. This is the thing I've always wanted. Finally, a man who knows how to bring it and can give me a full body orgasm and rock my world. Okay. He did not deliver. He did not deliver. And I found myself in the same position I was in, just a couple of years before when I was in my marriage of like, okay, this guy didn't bring it, and there's something more that I'm wanting, and what is going on here? And I came to the realization that if I wanted anything to be different, that I was going to have to make a change, and that surely if this man claimed he could give me this experience, then it's my body. Surely I could find the way to make that happen in my own body. So I made a declaration to undergo the study of my own sexuality. I decided I am just going to figure it out. I want to learn how my energy works, how my arousal works, what I like, what I don't like. And what is this pathway to these, blissful full body states and these more spiritual experiences? I'm gonna figure this out. I'm gonna find the pathway. As soon as I made that declaration, some crazy things happened. I had a book jump off the shelf at me when I was at my yoga class one day that really rocked my world, gave me a whole new approach to sex, which I started implementing right away on my weekly pleasure dates. I set aside a couple hours each week just to be with my own body and to touch myself sexually and intimately. And so I started applying this approach. And then maybe a couple or 3 weeks after that happened, I had a chance encounter with a somatic sex therapist that absolutely changed my life and convinced me that the somatic route is really the most transformational route to go. A couple weeks after that chance encounter, and I did a couple of sessions with him, I had an experience while I was in one of my pleasure dates where all of a sudden I just had this massive wave of pleasure start in the bottom of my feet, roll up through my whole body, and all this love just shot out of my heart. This pleasure is rippling through my whole body. I remember my hands were like tingling and my face was almost like numb and everything was my whole body was vibrating. And I have this realization like, oh my God, I'm having this full body orgasmic experience right now. And all this love was pouring out of my heart and tears were rolling down my eyes. It was like just the greatest love. And in that moment, I realized, like, oh my goodness, nobody brings this to me. No one can give me pleasure. No one can give me an orgasm. And love is literally who I already am. It's who I am. It's what I bring. It's who I am. I didn't have to now look and cling onto a relationship to try to get love. I didn't have to make a man responsible to give me pleasure, give me orgasm. I knew how to find that pathway within my own body. And that was the moment where I decided that I wanted to help more women find this pathway because the world would be different if more women were accessing their pleasure and wanted sex and enjoyed it and knew how to use their voice for what they wanted and liked. And also that I was going to become a sex therapist. I was actually in graduate school getting my master's degree when I had this big awakening. I was like 2 semesters in of about a 3-year process. And so I knew I'm like, I'm going to go into the field of sex therapy. And that's how I landed in the realm of sex therapy. And the somatics is something that I really have always incorporated, even when I was working in a more traditional private practice. Sex therapy falls under a mental health umbrella. And I did that for 10 years before I left mental health and really just decided to focus on the somatic sex coaching because that's really where people get the best results. And that is how I got to where I am today and doing the work that I'm doing today. Primarily now with couples. I really started out, my specialty is women's sexuality, but for the past decade, I have primarily worked with some individual women, but mostly it's couples that walked through my door. And so I just kind of leaned into that. And I really, really love the couples work as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to touch on, there's so many things that you said that I would love to take all those little pieces and unwind them a little bit more deeply, but I'm going to start with that inner pathway to pleasure because one, I know that that's a huge thing that you uncovered and discovered and help people with. And also
Yes.
because so many of us, I think men included, are conditioned to associate pleasure with sex, right? Or pleasure with
Yes.
this external thing that's going to bring us the pleasure.
Right.
And if we don't, quote, get it, then
Yeah.
something is wrong with that thing or that person or that
Yep.
relationship, right?
Yes.
Versus an inner cultivation
Yeah.
of the inner state that allows pleasure to run through us. And they are
Exactly.
two radically
Radically
different
different.
ways of approaching pleasure.
Yep.
And to unwind this a bit more, I'd love to hear, of course, just for the listeners, somatic, right? Soma, the
Oh, right.
body, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the body is how we access pleasure, but it's more than just the body. It is our consciousness and our energy, right? And so if you could talk a little bit more of that pathway to pleasure.
Yeah. Well, that is the name of my business, by the way, Pathway to Pleasure. That's my That is my bit, which I know you know. And that name came from that awakening that I had back in 2011 of I had found my own pathway to my own pleasure. And it is an inner cultivation, very much so. We have the misbelief, and a lot of the languaging around it out there is, oh, I want to give my girlfriend an orgasm, or I want to give him pleasure. And really, pleasure it's a natural state that exists within us when we clear the obstacles that are in the way, as is orgasm and as is love. As women, we are love. That is truly, legitimately what we are as women. It's the gift that we bring. It's who we are. It's what we are. And it's a sort of it's really not a concept. It's hard to talk about because it's really an experience. And so pleasure is no different. And the types of things that get in the way of our capacity to recognize ourselves as pleasure, as orgasm, as love are things such as the three types of tension. There's basically we'll just say tension as a title. And there are sort of three ways that we embody tension. We have mental tension, emotional tension, and physical tension. Physical tension, you can think like if you just went to the gym, you worked out, and you got some tightness or soreness in your muscles, that's physical tension. But physical tension also often is the byproduct of mental and or emotional tension. Mental tension might look like being up in the head all the time, having the to-do list running through your brain, just constantly up in the head, thinking what's happening tomorrow, what happened yesterday, anywhere but here now in the body. That's mental tension. Mental tension also comes into play when we start to develop emotional tension. So what that looks like is, wow, I'm really angry, but don't feel that. It's not safe to feel that. You shouldn't be feeling that. So we crystallize and tighten up around that emotion of, say, anger, for example. That turns into what I would call emotional tension. It's not free flowing through the body, or like condensed or crystallized around it. And part of that is because our mind came in and said, don't feel. It's not safe to feel. You shouldn't feel. Or why are you feeling that? Or I don't want to feel that. And then that can turn into body symptoms such as pain in the body or numbness. Pain or numbness are kind of the two ways that will show up in the body. I think we were talking about that on my podcast. Just like, yeah, you were saying the same exact thing. And I was like nodding my head, like, she gets it. She gets it. So when we start to work with pleasure or desire, and desire is sort of an aspect of pleasure, but pleasure is really connected to our ability to relax, presence our awareness in the body. And when we're able to do that, to have relaxation, so that's sort of the letting go of the tension, coming into full embrace of what arises when we relax, and then keeping our awareness and our attention in the sensations of the body. Or if you have the capacity for more subtle discerning, emotions are slightly more subtle than sensations. And then there's energy flows as well that are happening, which is another more subtle level. But we can't even get to that energy flow piece if we're still stuck in the not even be able to notice physical sensations, or we're up in our head, or there's tension happening. You're not going to get to that full body orgasmic state because you have all the emotional tension in the way. So the pathway to pleasure is about meeting and greeting, training the awareness to be in the body, and allowing whatever's there to arise. And in many cases, as was the case with my whole awakening, to fully allow yourself to feel exactly what's there. And I'm going to pause and let you respond, but I would love to give an example of how that showed up for me, just so your listeners can understand, like, kind of the more practical application of this and in their own lives, like what they can do. So I'll pause there for a minute.
Yeah. And before we do, so don't let me forget, I want to tie this to desire, because what I'm feeling as you're saying this is how often somebody will resist a sexual advance because they're not, quote, there yet.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The one person feels desire, the other doesn't. And so they
Mm-hmm.
resist the sexual advance and then
Yeah.
start to feel more closed off because they're not, quote, ready yet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, of course, you're not going to feel ready if you're in your head, if you're focusing on your to-do list, if you're constantly
Right.
in that mental state. And I think that's what I really want to highlight out of what you said, is that
Okay.
when we don't have that and develop that capacity to come out of the head,
Mm-hmm.
out of the to-do list, out of the mental state, out of the worry, out of the future, past, that's why the body is so key, right? Because we have to
Yeah.
bring the energy down into the body. We don't receive pleasure through the mind. I mean, come on. We don't
Right.
receive pleasure through the mind. We receive pleasure when we are experiencing something, and we experience
Yeah.
through the body. And I want to
Yes.
highlight that because sexual desire, or desire for anything, but let's just say sexual desire in particular, it requires a softening into the moment and then
Hmm.
allowing the desire, right, to be expressed and to create that
Yeah.
connection. And so
Yeah.
it's so in a relationship particularly, that's why at the beginning often it's easier for people to feel a lot of desire with each other, because it's like you're only thinking about that person and you're really in this hot and heavy state and blah blah blah, and it's new and this and it's exciting. And then the longer the relationship goes, what often happens is then people take the other for granted, right? I mean, there's a million things
Yeah.
that happen. Resentment
Yeah.
builds, take the other for granted, all the things. But what also often happens is you get caught more in the day to day versus the
Hmm.
newness and excitement. We are
Yes.
devoting that much energy into the relationship. And then that day to day is taking you away into
Yeah.
the head, away from the body, away from the energy, away from the connection. And then, of course, desire dissipates because
Yeah.
that isn't being cultivated in both
Right.
parties anymore. So,
Yeah.
okay, so you
There's
can
a
comment on that
lot.
if you want,
There's
and
like
then take us
three, yeah,
into,
four. There's like three or four
yeah.
things inside that I could respond to. And I think, gosh, I'm trying to feel into what would be the best one to start with, because there's really like four different directions I could go with that. Yeah, I mean, so on one hand, when there's sort of that difference in sexual, we'll just talk about sexual desire. There's one person wants it, the other person is not yet there. There's two things about that. One is in that moment, whose desire are we going to follow in that moment? Because that's a big problem. A lot of my couples that come to me, when you can this is what I say, like every couple should know how to answer this question. Who is it happening for? Whose desire, which means whose desire are we following right now? In that, and I can give examples later about why that's so critical. And a lot of people think, well, it's for both of us. But the problem in the scenario you just gave is that both people are in desire. I don't feel it. I do feel it. And now we
Mhm.
have a problem because there's nobody in the role of what we would call the giving role. I'm willing to provide. It's not my desire, but I'll follow your desire for a moment. I'll be willing to set mine aside and follow yours.
Or
Or maybe
connect at least enough to do that.
well, and here's the other piece to this. The person in that scenario who's saying, I'm not there yet, it doesn't mean they don't have desire. What they might need, what I would offer in that scenario is, what would you need so that you may be a little bit more available for sexual intimacy? Because the other piece of this, another third piece, is we all have sort of different portals into the sexual arousal. We have different arousal maps, like different things that actually will open us into the sexual turn on. For some people, it doesn't involve any touch at all. They can have orgasmic experiences and get really aroused with no touch at all. Other people need direct genital stimulation. That's their quickest gateway into arousal, while other people need to slow down with no pressure, no obligation. That's the gateway in. So even that person that's like, I'm not feeling it yet, what I would say is, where you find desire where it already is, find pleasure where it already is. Don't try to, can happen is, oh, I guess I have to get ready for sex now. It's either that or it's just a no, and then nothing happens and no one's getting what they want. But there's a middle ground where we can identify, okay, I'm not really feeling sexually aroused. My partner is. What might I need? And then I can advocate for that need to be met. I can either give it to myself, like, okay, I need to breathe, I need to relax, I need to take a hot shower, I need to light a candle, or I can advocate for it from my partner. What I need is just to cuddle you for about 10 minutes, or would you rub my shoulders? Um, so we start to identify what that thing is that would begin to open us into being able to be more interested and available for sexual intimacy. So there's a lot of pieces to that. The last piece that you mentioned is like the loss of attraction over time and long-term relationships. Yes, there's tons of reasons why that happens. There's a lot of emotional things that happen in a relationship where issues aren't really fully resolved, resentment builds up. And then there's also the topic of sexual polarity in how we cultivate that in a relationship, and how you keep the fire alive and keep the magnetic sexual attraction. Why it fades is because people just simply don't know how to consciously create. It's there at the beginning a lot of times, just naturally, but over time we habituate, we get used to our partner, everything feels the same, and we don't know how to create difference again. And difference is what's required for that sexual magnetism to really become supercharged, where there's just that intense desire to come into sexual union. And there's ways to consciously cultivate that. That's just another a skill set. And most couples don't understand that. So they end up in a situation where it feels really flat and there's loss of libido and sexual interest over time.
Mm-hmm. And the difference for me really can be, when you want to feel the difference, like you're saying, right? There has to be enough of difference for you to want to feel that desire, that union. I find that to be an interesting concept, in part because that difference is often, I want to know you're your own person. Like, I want to know that you are your own person, that you are not needing, not grasping, not demanding, right? There's that you want to feel, how do I say this in a way that you really can lose interest when you feel like that person isn't being fully true to themselves, or you're not attracted to who they're being, like they're
Mm-hmm.
the way they're acting, and you can lose
Yeah,
that desire, right?
for
and
sure.
and yet you want to feel like they're strong, you want to feel like they can meet you, you want to feel
Mm,
you there's just so much, right, that can take that away when there isn't that connection and that communication and that radical honesty and that vulnerability in
mm,
relationships. But what often happens is couples are so consciously or unconsciously codependent, and they
mm,
are seeking, right, their needs to be met by the other. They're placing these demands on the other, these expectations on the other. And I'm only going to feel good if you feel good. And I'm only going to do
oh,
that if you do that. And then it creates this, like,
yeah,
there's not enough separation and difference for
right.
desire to be there, because you're not your own entity, your own person, your
Mm,
own self. At that point, there's just too much, quote, entanglement. It's not actually
yeah,
love.
enmeshment.
It's
Yes.
enmeshment,
Yeah.
but it's so
Well, yeah,
common.
it is. And there's a lot inside this question too. And if you think about it, if we're wanting to create, everyone wants passion, which actually the root of that word means suffering. It's so funny. We're like, I want more passion in my relationship. Well, like, aren't you having enough pain already? Sure, you want more. But we know how that translates in our modern day. Passion is like the fire. It's the fire. It's the desire for intimacy, for connection. If you're building an actual fire, what does fire need? What do you actually need to get the fire? You need space, you need air. And so if those logs are too packed together, you're just going to get smoke, or you're just not going to get anything. And the same is true in relationships. So correct, we need to have enough space. And when I say space, there's a difference between space and distance. So distance would be like, okay, I'm going to take off to Jamaica for 2 weeks. I'll see you. Like that's distance, right? You can still be at a distance and have no space in a relationship. Space is my ability and my partner's ability, for example, to lean back, to settle back, that inward and downward settling into the internal awareness of our own being, and to be fully and completely present in that moment without clinging to something, needing something to be different or needing a certain outcome, and also without aversion, without trying to avoid or get away or fix something in the moment, and without trying to get anywhere, without having an agenda to get anywhere. That's actually how we create space. And so it's an internal alchemy. It's an internal process of doing that. And the other piece to this, to make it really simple, is the craft of creating sexual polarity is really just about the interplay of consciousness and light. And how we do that is through a conscious choice for one person to play one role or embody one role and the other embody the opposite role. And now this is not at all about what I can't stand about, like, some of the conversation on this is the masculine and feminine. And, because we talked about this too.
Yeah.
We chatted a couple days ago for Sex Talk Cafe. Yeah. It's this idea that, oh, well, I'm a man and that means these certain things. And and I'm a woman, so I have to
Like,
be
please
just
don't
soft.
go there. Oh.
Yeah, so I have to act just like, helpless and soft, and that is actually really, That's sort of the distorted expression of what I'm speaking to in the world. It's not the true feminine and the true masculine. And, a lot of us and most of us, and thank goodness for this, have sort of a weaving, there's a weaving together of these different qualities. But what polarity is really about is learning to embody one or the other and to do it consciously and on purpose. So I know that because I'm a businesswoman, but I'm also extremely feminine. I mean, I have a very well-developed masculine side. I have to have that to get shit done in the world, to accomplish things, to be directive, to do the work and to hold space holding for my clients. I mean, that's a very masculine quality, the ability to see into them deeply. um, Holding space versus being immersed in my own emotions, right? Two very different things. So I have a very well developed masculine side, but I also have a very well integrated ability of my feminine side to deeply feel and to immerse myself into my own pleasure, that inward and downward focus. So, how you play with polarity is one person just chooses to be the feeler in the deep immersion into pleasure, immersion into sound and voice and feeling and emotion and expressing that as light or energy, which is a lot of women how we do it. I wear dresses and earrings and makeup and sparkly things. That's like the expression of radiance. It's one of the gifts of the feminine. The masculine embodiment is that capacity to penetrate and to be in stillness and to be the container and be the space and to see. And so there's ways to do that in relationship where you do it on purpose and consciously. And it should not be done rigidly. We should be able ideally to be fluid in between the two, but to do it consciously and choose it is phenomenally fun. And it's such a hot way to get the fire back and to get the juices going again in relationship where you don't have to do a lot of the psychological processing. Not that there's value to that. And I can do that as well with my clients. Obviously, I have training in mental health and I've done that for many years. But there's a simpler way where what we really want, we don't really want to sit there and go into our heads for 2 years of couples therapy when what we're really desiring is deep connection and love, which is a much more terrifying edge for most people to work on because most of us are very committed to our resentment and to not taking responsibility, to blaming the other. And you can stay in that's why I do the somatic work, because I just feel like there's such a limit to talking about and analyzing problems when what people really want is just to feel connected. So let's just go into connection and let's meet and greet all the crap that's within our own bodies and minds and spirits that are keeping us from that. And there's just very more direct ways to do that. That can also be a lot of fun. It's not as painful as couples therapy. Couples therapy is great, don't get me wrong, but there's other things out there, folks.
Depends too on, right? Like there are relationships in which people try to focus on, okay, well, sex isn't happening, so sex must be the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, they're ignoring the well of problems that actually exist that are creating the lack of desire.
Exactly.
And then there's also the kind of relationship in which they have all of that, but the fire's not there. And they're two, again, very different circumstances. And in both, this is where I always bring it back to sovereignty, right? Individual sovereignty and how that creates freedom and desire in relationship, because we are acculturated, we are conditioned, as you were just saying, to blame the other, look at them as the problem. How can they change? How could we fix this? Let's fix this. Let's quote, make it better, right? It's a very, I don't like the word patriarchal, but it feels appropriate here. Like a very patriarchal way of trying to resolve a problem versus let's lean into what is actually alive. Let's lean into what is actually present. Let's lean into what we're actually experiencing and feeling and what's needing to be expressed, what's wanting to be expressed. But instead of looking at the other person so much as the quote problem, how we show up in relationship. And maybe as we investigate how we show up, we realize I'm showing up without the boundaries I need or without the expression I need. And therefore, now that I'm showing up for me, I'm realizing this is just not a relationship I can be in, right? There's that too.
Absolutely.
And then there's also that I'm not showing up in my body in a way that's allowing me to receive the pleasure that might
Yeah.
actually be available for me if
Oh,
I
that's
showed up
huge.
differently, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, right, because the opening up that ability to receive, and we could even start to define that as just the capacity to notice, to feel, to notice what's happening in the body, to notice sensation, and inside of that, to notice what do I want, what do I need, or what would I need, what are my desires, what am I feeling right now? Right? That piece and the pleasure keys process that I've developed, there's what I call in the second triad of that. It's called the three N's. And the skills that we learn in that triad are the skill of noticing, naming, and then negotiating. And noticing is that very first piece of that triad because when we don't have access to that, we are not going to be able to name what we really want if we don't know. And we're certainly not going to be able to effectively negotiate the receiving or the giving of the thing if we can't name it and can't feel it. So that ability to come into the body and begin to just pay attention to sensation and to notice what's there is the starting point for opening what's called the direct route of pleasure. So we have two ways we experience pleasure. One's called direct, the other, rightly so, is indirect. The direct route of pleasure is what I'm speaking to when we're talking about the nerve endings on the skin directly up to translates information directly up to the brain. And we can translate it as either pain or pleasure, right? But it's direct through the body. Indirect pleasure is the opposite of that, where there's stimulus coming in through the visual cortex through the eyes. For example, watching pornography would be an example of indirect pleasure. I'm seeing something on a screen, and maybe I'm feeling nice sensations in my body from that information coming in through the visual cortex. So these are two very different ways our body experiences pleasure. Both are important and valid. Problem is, many of us get overly dependent on that indirect route and or we get disconnected from the direct route due to a whole bunch of factors over the lifespan. Little t traumas, big T traumas, religious programming, social conditioning, family upbringing and influences, negative beliefs and shame around sex. And when we don't have access to that direct route because of all that stuff in the way, the shame, we end up tolerating stuff. We're afraid to ask for what we want. We don't know. We're disconnected. The work is in that clearing out of that debris so we can open that pathway for direct sensation and direct pleasure through the body. It's a critical piece to being able to access and eventually be able to discern desire. And desire, whether it's sexual or not, is not so important. It's your capacity to notice it and to name it. Because once we find it where it already lives, as we get really good at that and honoring that without making it wrong or it's not enough or it's too much, and we have a really great experience, ideally relationally with another human where that's honored as well in that way, then it naturally will start to expand. Eventually, it will feel safer to feel more, safer to receive more. And it's that capacity to allow ourselves to receive and respond to sensation that takes us eventually into potentially very deep orgasmic states. We have to learn the receiving path. This is my belief anyway. Receiving actually comes first. And that's the secret that nobody's talking about, the capacity to unconditionally receive. We hear all the time about unconditional giving and this lie, I believe, that giving is better than receiving. That's bullshit. They are both equal and opposite, and receiving is an absolute holy, holy act because if there is nobody there to receive a gift, then no gift can ever be given. So you negate any kind of giving. And if we're
And that they're
receiving,
not separate, right? They're not
no, they're not separate.
separate, the
It's the yin
giving
and
and
the you
receiving.
can't how could you separate the two? It's just like the yin and the yang. How could you separate them? And so there's a lot of distorted beliefs around receiving and that it's selfish and it's better to give than to receive and that's a lie. When we learn how to deeply receive, that was my path when I went through my whole sexual awakening. It was learning how to receive sensation, receive pleasure, to notice what I wanted, to ask for it. I eventually attracted a lovely partner into my life a number of months after my declaration to study my own sexuality, he was really excited to like learn and grow. And he's like, what, and he just was a giver as well. He just loved like, your wish is my command. Like, oh, you want that? I would be happy to do that to you. But I was empowered in my voice and I allowed myself to unconditionally receive, meaning that I wasn't sitting in the back of my head going, oh gosh, I'm gonna have to like give back. And what if I'm being selfish? And we block our capacity to receive. And I feel so guilty for receiving all this attention. Like I learned how to kind of work through some of that negative chatter, which was blocking my
Very
ability to receive.
vulnerable.
Very vulnerable. But
Very.
what it turned into when I was so filled from the authentic, unconditional receiving, it transitioned into this like uncontrollable desire to serve and to give because I had received so much. Like it just all of a sudden there was just this moment. I remember like, oh my God, like I have to give this. Like, please let me do this for you. Like I just want to give this because I was overflowing. I was so full. I had allowed myself just to receive for quite a while. And then it just sort of shifted, and then I was really wanting to give. And so both we have access to both of those, and one isn't better than the other. But it's sort of a spiritual secret that I think is far overlooked. It's sort of one of those mystical truths that's been destroyed by the negative patriarchal influences and religion and the control of sex.
Yeah, we could probably talk all day about why that was very intentionally put on us,
Yes, we could.
particularly as women. And and
Yeah.
and I think that it's in part this illusion lie that receiving is separate from giving when it is that overflow state, but that overflow requires internal overflow, right? It always comes back to the self, that internal overflow, so that when you
Yeah.
give, you are receiving, and when you are receiving, you are giving, and there is no separation. But that takes being willing to be seen, which is really what is required to be vulnerable. It takes internal safety, right? It takes so much more than just, oh, okay, I'm going to receive. Because what can happen is when that, oh, I'm ready to receive. I've seen this, I would call this a wounded feminine um, aspect, is that when the feminine is like, I just want to receive now because I'm coming into my feminine. But then
Ah.
it's still this needy, graspy energy, and it's a taking
Oh.
energy, which is no different than a masculine energy of taking, right?
Mhm.
It's no different. It's just
Mm.
repeating a detrimental cycle, and that
Yeah.
that receiving is coming, true receiving, at least my experience. And then I want to also turn this into what you were going to share, your story about your pathway, like
Yeah.
coming into your pleasure, because that receiving pleasure is so connected to receiving, obviously.
Yeah.
And my path to it has been less about like, oh, I want to receive, and more about just like owning the internal worthiness and owning my
Yeah.
internal capacity, and receiving all of me. And then the
Hmm.
more I receive all of me, and the more I am just
Yes.
anchoring into my worthiness, everything I give is from overflow, because there's
Yeah.
no more duty, there's no more obligation, right? It takes away,
Right.
it's the work with the programming and the
Yes.
unraveling. And
Well,
so,
you just,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, you speak to a really fundamental, this is a spiritual truth of receiving, is that the core of it and the thing that often prevents us from that deep unconditional receiving is the unworthiness, is sort of the pattern, or it's the program that's usually running underneath that what I see a lot of people say is, I have to feel worthy first before I can receive, but it's actually not true. How we
Exactly.
become worthy is through the receiving. You're actually expanding our capacity and feeling everything there is to feel, feeling the unworthiness. Oh, am I being selfish? Oh, maybe I'm just like, an inconvenience because I'm receiving, like all that chatter. It's just embracing that and still allowing receive like a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And eventually that shifts. The worthiness piece then is now no longer like the operating program underneath our lives, and we can come into that state of fullness like you were speaking to. And that is the receiving actually is the healing of
Because
that
it's
program.
rewiring.
Yeah.
It's rewiring the story, but it has to be done consciously, right? To
Yes.
rewire, because
Absolutely.
it's basically allowing it to come in, noticing what's been blocking it, so it can be transmuted so that you
Yes.
can actually rewire the system to open
Yeah.
to receive and be seen and right, which is requires trust and all the other things too. Like, if
Yeah.
you're trying to receive from somebody you don't trust, you're banging your head against the wall. It's not
Yeah.
going to work.
And yeah,
So,
and you said something really important too that I want to speak to. The first level receiving is receiving ourselves, our ability. And that's what I did when I, went on my exploration of my own sexuality. It was learning how to receive myself fully. And with that, a lot of people are like, what does that mean? Receive yourself? Well, that don't make any sense. But what it means is it's our ability to fully embrace and feel and be with this vertical alignment, the internal space of everything that's arising, the pleasure and the pain, the longing, the desire without judgment. And I use the word embrace a lot in my work, which is really that's sort of like the feminine aspect of the welcoming presence and how we can learn to be in relationship with ourselves, our own bodies, our own desires, our own pleasure, our own pain. In that stance, that is how we receive ourselves. We learn to trust our own emotions instead of being afraid of them, like running away, I don't want to feel, or clinging to, oh, I want to feel this positive thing. I don't want to feel that negative thing. All of that just creates more resistance. So as we learn that self-receiving, it becomes much easier in the horizontal plane, the relational field, and externally, to allow ourselves to receive in that way from the world or from others.
so let's circle around. Let's circle back as we start
Okay.
to, just for time's sake, because otherwise we're going to talk
Yes.
for hours and hours and hours.
Forever.
Never stop. So, except for chocolate and wine. So let's circle back to, you started to talk about the pathway to pleasure, right? Which is what you teach, but you started to talk about that, you're opening into that. So let's
Yes.
start to wrap up there.
Yeah, sure. Well, so what it started with, I mentioned that I made a date with myself every single week. I decided I was going to get real intentional. I just was going to learn my body and find out, what feels good, what doesn't, blah, blah, blah. So I took time every week and touched myself intimately. And what was so interesting, I learned how to slow down. So that was one of the principles I was working with, really slowing down and getting rid of this idea that I had to get anywhere, meaning that I wasn't going to touch myself in order to have an orgasm. So, okay, I got rid of that. I'm not trying to have an orgasm. I'm not rushing towards, I'm slowing down and I'm learning how to just notice sensations. That was the task I gave myself. Traditionally, what I would do when I would masturbate, I would use fantasy, and I could get it off pretty quick, get to orgasm pretty fast. And there you go. Like I accomplished the thing, but I really wanted something different. So my agreement was I'm going to refrain from reverting to fantasy, which was such a habit for me, as I believe it is for a lot of us. I'm just going to kind of set that on the shelf over here. I can always come back to it. Fantasy's lovely. It has a nice place, I believe, in our sexual landscape. But if we want something different, and then we have to do something different. So I set aside the habit of fantasizing and I learned just to focus on sensation. And what happened was I noticed I didn't actually have a lot of sensitivity in my genitals. And I actually had a lot of numbness. When I slowed down and really got present, I just didn't feel a whole lot. And the first reaction was, I should be feeling more. Let me use fantasy so I can make my body feel more. And I was like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. We're trying to do something different here. Okay, hold on. All right, let's come back in and just notice the numbness, embrace, let it be there. And then I started to get really frustrated because I thought I should be feeling more. So I
Mhm.
caught myself there. But if you notice, I'm not numb anymore. Now I'm having some frustration. So I am just embrace the frustration. And eventually what happened was I dropped past the numbness, past the frustration. And what was there was just this deep grief, just this sorrow and grief that eventually moved up from my genitals and started to pour out my heart. And I just allowed myself to go there. I just let it process out. I cried, I sobbed. And after a few sessions that were sort of similar to that, other emotions came out and I just said yes to them. I started to have more sensitivity. I started to feel more in my genitals. And I was really staying on this path of not trying to go for a climax, not reverting to fantasy. And that was when I had that massive full body orgasmic experience. I was just relaxed. I was in my body. I wasn't trying to get anywhere. I wasn't trying to make anything happen. I wasn't up in my head trying to create sexy thoughts to make myself get off. And that was when I realized that the things that had been in the way of my ability just to access that kind of at will and so easily were things like the emotional tension, right? Like not ever being able to feel anger, for example, in the family I grew up in. It was all, be nice, smile, don't be angry, don't be sad, like always only put a smile on. But what happened was I shut down my ability to feel the anger and then also my ability to feel the joy. And so I just had this flatness, but all those emotions were still there because it's part of our life force, it's part of our libido. All of our emotions are part of our sexual energy.
Mhm.
So it had all just translated into the body as that lack of sensation. And as I just let myself feel and got that flow happening again, and I wasn't so afraid of it, I wasn't like terrified anymore of being angry or feeling sad because I knew it was just going to move through my body. That was where my sexual energy, my libido, the pleasure, the orgasm, and this knowing myself very viscerally as love itself, like that's what's actually there when we remove the obstacles to pleasure. So I had found my pathway to pleasure, and that's an aspect of the work that I do with women and with couples is helping them learn how to how to do that inner cultivation that you were speaking to earlier. It's the inner work of sex and intimacy that's so often overlooked. That it's the outer work that's out there in the world, how to have, give a better blowjob or a hand job, how to get her to sleep with you tonight, like techniques and tips and tricks. And that stuff
Very
is,
shallow
yeah, it
approach to
kind of
these things.
is. Yeah. Yeah. Just how to get harder and last longer and have bigger orgasms. That really, you can learn all that stuff, but it doesn't address the core of what's actually happening. And especially in a relationship where two people are on different pages in sex and intimacy and they're trying to get back on the same page, just having bigger orgasms is not going to solve the problem. It's not going to make her want to fuck you, like just knowing how to do that, right?
No.
So
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot more going on, and it's that inner work, that deeper work of sex and intimacy that's really the gateway where you can build a future on that. It's a foundation. That's what I teach at my couples, the immersions that I do, the Pleasure Keys retreats for couples. I mean, it's really like taking them deep in to the Pleasure Keys process where they cultivate that and learn how to create the foundation. From there, once you have that roadmap and the common language and the framework to operate from, you can go almost anywhere. And it comes back to what you said earlier. It's literally about coming out of the shadow and the unconsciousness. It's about and creating the clarity, becoming aware of and conscious. When you have that clarity, everything gets so much easier. It becomes so much easier to find that pathway to pleasure and then also to know how to negotiate it. That third piece of my three N's, notice, name, negotiate. We can't do negotiating if we don't have access to, if we're not clear and we don't know whose
Exactly.
desire are we following, who's the giver, who's the receiver, what do I want? Am I willing to give that, not willing to give that? Where are my limits? So all of that's part of building that foundation. And I teach that in the Pleasure Keys.
So I talked about my Sacred Feminine Power retreat on your podcast.
You
So I want you
did?
to talk about your retreat
Okay.
here,
Yes.
just so people kind of know what you offer in your retreat.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's called the Pleasure Keys Immersion, and it is a retreat for couples. And what we do at these immersions, they're 3 days long, and we really work for like half days, like 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. But over the course of 3 days, and I take you deep into my Pleasure Keys process, which is a series of 9 wisdom codes that are broken into 3 different triads, where you're building, like a lot of what we talked about here today, Jessica, you're building the skills of how to actually do that in a practical way where there's actually some of what we're talking about. I think if you're not having, it's experiential, right? And so it's very hard to talk about experiential stuff. You have to have the experience is how you learn it, not just analyzing it or watching a YouTube video or listening to a podcast, which are all great. But where the rubber meets the road is by actually getting into your body and having the experience, for example, of, let's say you have a real hard time asking for what you want. So what we do at the immersions, at the Pleasure Keys, is we go deep into experiential practices where you are encountering the very thing, the very obstacle that's in your way of, say, asking for what you want. And we do that through a series of embodiment practices, connection practices. It's fully clothed. There's no overt sexual or genital touching that happens. We do use some non-sexual touch practices, and it's just the couples partner together for the whole retreat. And it's really helping them to be able to solve this problem of mismatched desire together and how to get on the same page. And that relates back to really every relationship in their life, but specifically, most couples are coming to these retreats because they're having challenges in the sex and intimacy aspect of the relationship. Everything else is great, but they're challenged in the sex and intimacy. And so once they leave that, they are equipped to be able to navigate and move forward and make sex easy, fun, make it flow again. They have the skills to do that and to know how to navigate through future challenges because that's always going to happen. If you really come in and you develop these skills and these wisdom codes, you'll know what's happening. You'll be able to pinpoint the issue, and then you're empowered in your own sovereignty to be able to resolve that. You'll have the skills to do that because you know how to create the clarity. So I do these immersion experiences several times a year, kind of looking to expand that and do them, maybe every other month or maybe monthly at some point. But right now they're several times a year, and you can get more information on that at pathwaytopleasure.com. That's my website. And then I do have a free resource on the first triad of the pleasure keys called Pleasure Keys. It's an ebook that I wrote for download, and that's at pleasurekeys.com if anybody's interested in grabbing that and kind of having a little bit more of a practical application to what we talked about and sort of that introduction to how you can start today. I give some tips and some practices that you can start on right away to start to implement some of what we've talked about here, and that's at pleasurekeys.com.
Beautiful. Pleasurekeys.com. It'll be in the links below. And it's so important because we're in a society where we're not taught emotional intimacy. We're not taught sexual intimacy. We're not taught these tools. And so when a couple has, right, an otherwise healthy relationship and they want to deepen the intimacy, sometimes it is learning like how to do that, especially, with each other when, because intimacy with other does come with intimacy with self, and it's like teaching people how to do that and how to craft that. It's really beautiful offering. So yes, well, I'm so glad that we had this conversation today, and I look forward to more conversations about sexuality and intimacy and relationships because we both share a deep passion for that. And we'll be doing more, so be on the lookout. Be sure to subscribe, like, comment, let us know if you have particular topics you want us to address in our conversations. We'll be happy to do so. And don't forget to listen to the podcast that we did on the Sex Talk podcast as well, where we dove a little deeper into sacred sexuality and various other pieces of the divine feminine. And we'll see you next time. Have a beautiful week.